You are listening to episode 278 of The Secular Buddhists. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Reva Patwardhan joins us to speak about her article, The Freedom Trap, where conversations about cultural appropriation go to die. Hi, everyone. I want to thank you for supporting the Secular Buddhist Association with your generous contributions. Because of you, we're able to continue offering this podcast, the discussions on our website, secularbuddhism.org, and of course, our live online practice circle. And if you haven't yet, you're welcome to visit the website and show your appreciation, as we appreciate you listening in and sharing your own voice in this exploration of the Dhamma in the world. Thank you. We're glad to have you join the conversation. There's a lot of talk about cultural appropriation lately, and much of it has been just that. Talk. Not conversation, not engagement, and very rarely dialogue. The topic is very difficult to have in a multicultural society where the lines of distinction may be a bit fuzzy around the edges, and it's not always clear what's appropriation and what's appreciation. Problems inherent with the complexity of the topic have been magnified because of the quality of the talking, and perhaps not enough listening. Curiosity, maybe kindness, maybe a willingness to stumble. Reva Patwardhan has over 15 years of broad experience in the nonprofit sector. Before becoming an executive coach, she was a fundraiser, communications director, a diversity trainer, brand strategist, a board member, and a lobbyist. Pursuing her lifelong interest in leadership development, Reva became certified as an integral coach from New Ventures West. Since becoming an executive coach, she has joined the board of directors at Rethink Media and the board of directors at Peace Action. Reva also serves as a faculty coach at Alethea, the School of Integral Unfoldment. So sit back, relax, and have a nice tea of your choice that may have some cultural meaning to you. Our guest today is Reva Patwardhan. Reva, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's been an interesting engagement. There's been a lot of information lately online about cultural appropriation. And before we dive into that, I wanted to give you a chance to tell us about your background, because you're in many ways uniquely qualified to some of the nuances of this topic.
Well, at least I have a lot of fodder for opinions. Whether that qualifies me, I don't know. So my background. So I was born in the United States to immigrant parents from India, and I grew up in Virginia. I spent the first 22 years of my life in Virginia. And the town I grew up in was the kind of town where I felt like an outsider there. There were not a lot of people there that I felt like I could relate to. And so I left. I moved to California where all of a sudden everybody was like me. It seems like. I think that is probably one of the main, if there is a qualification or not qualification, I think that's probably one of the main things that informs my point of view on things having to do with living in a multicultural world.
Mm-hmm.
That piece of being, when you stand outside of something, it gives you a way of seeing it in a way that's different. And the thing is I was standing both inside of it and outside of it. I am a product of the dominant culture as much as anybody, and I could see it from outside. And I think there really is something to the idea that people who are bicultural, biracial, people who somehow life has put them with one foot in and one foot out, they have this capacity to see things differently, see it from both the inside and the outside. And that can just make you a really good observer, when you experience life as being from the outside. For me, going to school with a bunch of kids who I had the sense that they all knew each other, and I had the sense that maybe they all knew each other from church. This is all going back to stuff when I was, maybe 5 or 6, just this feeling like, oh, everybody here seems to know each other.
Yes.
And that may not have been true.
Mm-hmm.
But just this feeling that I had. And so to kind of observe and start to try to make sense of what the rules are.
You describe it, it put me in a mind of that first day at a new school that lasts for years.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just that moment that, how do I fit here? It's something that it doesn't end. It keeps going.
Yeah.
It's so uncomfortable.
Yeah, so it's, how does this work? How does this work? And you do, and I think some kids, and I was a sensitive kid, and there's all kinds of individual differences. So some kids move in this way and they're very comfortable with it. And me being a sensitive kid, I was always a little uncomfortable. But this way of just saying, okay, so what's happening here? What are the rules here that are different than the rules that I have at home? And my classmates, they act differently with their parents than the way I act, the way that my parents seem to expect that I act with them. All these things that I'm seeing that are invisible if you're only inside it. So I think that just turned me into an observer of culture. I'm really interested in culture in general, not just the appropriation of it, but just all of it.
Right.
And, when I moved out here, it was a very, it was one big step towards finding a sense of home. When I say out here, I mean to the Bay Area, California. And I, started working for a peace group, and I did that for a while, and then I did that for a long while, and I became a coach, working with progressive leaders, and now you find me at an interesting time. I'm getting ready to launch something new called Dialogue Lab, which is actually looking at how to help progressive leaders build the kind of cultures, build actually a culture of dialogue that will help our organizations and our movement thrive.
Yeah, and I want to hear more about that. Actually, at the end, we'll chat about that a little bit. And for those who are listening, if you've listened to this podcast before, I'm going to link to these things on the episode page. Up again towards the end. I wanted us to dive into the article that you wrote, and I'm wondering if you might describe a little bit about what you were seeing or perhaps hearing that prompted you to take that action and write that article.
Yeah. Well, this is something that I kept finding myself writing about over and over again. In this article, it's about cultural appropriation, but that's actually not what I was writing about.
Right. And that was the wonderful thing to see about it. It's like, it's not your standard cultural appropriation article.
Yeah, and I think what I was really writing about was the way we talk about cultural appropriation, and it's just for me, I just kept finding myself saying some of the same things over and over again in different ways on different topics. And this one happened to be on cultural appropriation. And it's the way that we have of in social change work, when we're all here trying to create a better world, we're trying to create better worlds inside of us as well as outside of us. I know the people listening to this podcast are going to be in some sort of practice of creating that world inside of them and possibly outside of them too. And when we're in that, there's some ways that sometimes we need laws. We need, clear black and white. This is the way it needs to be, and this is the way it needs to not be. And if it's this way, then there's going to be consequences that are enforced, right? And then there's big, wide swaths of change work that I don't think can be like that. And I also, something that's just one of my own biases is I really don't like being told what to do.
That must be difficult, having that pushback and having a sensitive child.
Yes. Never liked it. Do not like it. And I have a 3-year-old now. He just turned 3 today. Today's his birthday. So I'm getting a taste of it.
It's your turn now.
Getting a taste of it. And, there's a part of me that also does not like it when I see other people being told what to do. And there's a part of me that has my own visceral reactions to the way I see culture be used. And so how to integrate those two things? I have strong opinions about what I believe is right and wrong, what I want to see in the world. Yet I also have this value for personal freedom, and that there are times when you have to make a choice. This personal freedom is not as important as this person's personal freedom to be able to love and marry who they want. Your personal freedom to, not officiate gay weddings is not as important to me as this couple's freedom to love who they want, right? So we have to make choices like that. And so this is always a question that I'm in, and I don't have any real, and that's, I think, another thing that I come to this is that I have strong opinions, yet I also have a sense of skepticism about my own opinions, that I don't have a sense that I have all the answers. What I really want is better conversations about all of this stuff. I just want better conversations where we all feel, where possible, and it's not always possible, but where possible, we feel like we have the freedom to make individual choices about things. And we also have a sense of responsibility to do what's right and to do what feels in integrity with us. We have a responsibility to know what our values are and to act in accordance with them with as much mindfulness as we can bring to it.
That's one of the things that I'm glad you brought that up. And that was one of the most important pieces of your writing, was the need to improve the level of discourse, that the dialogues themselves need help. And that's a great deal of what you wrote about, and we'll dive into that in a bit. What I am finding, and as I mentioned before we started recording this tonight, is that just this afternoon, being in a couple of different conversations, that one with a friend and it started a little acrimonious, a little black and white, and it was challenging to find myself in the position of responding with gentleness to help show that, so what I'm hearing is this, and here's why I'm finding that not to be so. And it's an experience. And here are the examples for you, so you have an understanding. And the response was wonderful, and the conversation, that dialogue, was wonderful, because it grew into, oh, I hear what you're saying. Yes, and finding great commonality, and yet there is a lot of polarity right now, even in people who are essentially on the same side. Because I think, we're human beings, and we don't like being told, and we have, I certainly share with you strong opinions, and it's sometimes really difficult to just listen for a little bit and share gently, and let alone in enthusiastic friendliness in the dialogue. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering what your experience with that has been when you know there's an agreement here, and it's just hard to get to that. How have you approached that?
See, for me, I think that I often am not thinking about when I'm entering into that conversation. I'm not necessarily thinking about where is the agreement. I'm thinking about, are we hearing each other?
Mm-hmm.
Is this actually a conversation? And what can I say, or how can I be in this to get us to that place? Because if I'm trying to figure out how to, and this is something I've been practicing and learning, I remember having this experience a long time ago. There was a woman that I worked with who she had really strong opinions that always felt a little off kilter to me. And she was also really charismatic. So she could hold court with these off kilter opinions. And there was just something, I would just get tense around her because I disagreed with her. And it was hard to listen to her say things that to me were in some ways confusing, or I just did not agree with her. And at one point I was just like, what is that? What am I afraid of here? And just kind of walking myself to a place of, there's no threat here. She can think what she wants to think. There's no threat here. And then I started to have more space there, just for myself, to have more space. Like, there's nothing I need to do here. There's no activity for me here. I don't have a compulsion or a responsibility or a mandate to change other people's minds, right? Not that I give that up. I'm not saying that that's not something that can't happen, but if that's the focus, then I just get, I'm just too defended. And so what I try to do is just like, well, I tend to notice the process a lot more. And that's not always, there's good and bad to that. Sometimes, aside from the content, I get really frustrated with the process, because that's what I'm paying attention to.
So in the article itself, in fact, part of the title is the freedom trap. And if you might describe what that is for folks who haven't read the article yet, which, again, will be linked on the episode page.
Yeah. So there's a couple different pieces of it. One is when we frame conversations about things like cultural appropriation as, you have to stop doing that. You can't do this. These are the do's and don'ts. And, some people like that. I think there's some people who are like, just tell me what not to do, But when you frame it like that, there can be a way that it can shut people down, right? So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, for me, I think there was some way that I was trying to take people by the shoulders who were having these big reactions and just say, get a grip. No one's coming after you and your beads or whatever, This is a conversation. And, and to me, that's the freedom trap. It's like, when we think that these conversations are about trying to tell us what to do, and this is me talking to myself too, right?
Yeah.
If I see this as people just telling me what to do, then I'm losing sight of the fact that I'm an adult human being with agency. I have the freedom to do there's some things I don't have the freedom to do, right? But mostly I have the freedom to do these things. I also have the freedom to examine my integrity, to examine my values. I have the freedom to do inquiry. I have the freedom to hold myself accountable. I have all of these freedoms. These are all choices I can make. Which choices are most aligned in my values? That's the question that I want to be. It's not about freedom, right? And I think we often talk about it as if it is. Why can't I just da 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 da. Well, yeah, you can just da 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 da. That's not what we're talking about. What's important to you? Doing this, like wearing a war bonnet to Coachella, or your value for dignity and respect for all people. What's important? Yeah. And that's a certain kind of example. And I know that you have some examples that are probably more nuanced than that.
Yeah, and there always are, and that's something that it's an ongoing exploration, and why there's, I don't think, ever going to be well, here's the answer. I know you've been waiting, and here we are at the other end of the function machine, just waiting to catch what the answer is for all of our issues around this. But it's not that easy. Each situation is unique, even with the same people in very similar circumstances. There are nuances to what may be a variation of cultural respect and admiration, not an appropriation, but only for one side of it. That's someone who is embedded in that culture, because, as you say, when you're on the inside, you have another perspective. And someone from the outside, like myself, I can never know what that might be. I think where I found the brilliance in what you wrote is that engagement can only happen through dialogue. It's not a set of rules. It is in that dynamic of engagement, of connection, and honoring whatever that happens to arise from that.
Yeah.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about that, just moving a bit into appropriation itself. You talk about some very pragmatic and realistic ways to have this conversation in a fruitful way. And you talk about ways to avoid that freedom trap. And also what I found very rich was the 7 mindful questions, although they're actually more than 7, because you have some bundles in there and a few of them, and they're all just outstanding. But I wanted to have you describe, this is for a Buddhist podcast, even secular Buddhist podcast. We love our lists. So it's about the 5 and the 7.
Sure. No rules. So the 5 ways to avoid the freedom trap. The first one is something I think I've been talking about, and it's no rules and no tantrums. Let's be adults here. Right? That's basically. And since I touched on that one, I'll just move to the second one. The second one is we can't control culture. Culture is an ornery thing. It does what it does, and we can influence it. But even the way that we influence culture, it's often more in just the way we show up versus the rules we make. Like, what's more, well, this is a false dichotomy, but, Beyonce is out there influencing the heck out of some culture, right? And it has to do with what she's inspiring in people and just the way she shows up and her voice and all of that stuff. So culture, it just has a mind of its own. And so this is about just saying, okay, it's an organic thing that we're trying to influence. So how do we influence that in a way that's life-affirming, in a life-affirming direction?
I think that brings up a very important aspect to this is, as you mentioned, not only is culture not a concretized thing, it's dynamic. There are changes. There are subtleties just from one physical block to a few blocks over in a geographic location. But also it's not the same for all of the people within that culture. There are other influences in there that impact. I mean, as part of your example is, it's not just I was born in the West in this kind of family. It's much more complex than that. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And, I've benefited quite a lot from, and I think that, I've actually learned a bit more about this since I've written this piece. the distinction between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation. And, I don't have a definition nailed down or anything like that, but it's just something I've been continuing to learn about. But I have benefited quite a bit from cultural exchange in my personal life. The mix of what are parts of my traditional culture. I was raised Hindu, and the ways that the West has taken pieces of that and mixed it up with Western psychology. I have gotten, that's been a real blessing for me. Yoga, American yoga has been a real blessing for me, And I know that there's some people who will say, American yoga is an appropriation, and that's a conversation to have. That's fine. I'm open to having that conversation. But it's been a benefit to me personally. So, I really am interested in looking at, not even looking at, just having that sense of that this is not an easy black and white thing. I will also, and I feel like I want to speak to the other side of it, there have also been some uncomfortable things for me about the gray area between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation, and just to not even that sometimes, I'll go somewhere and I'll see somebody wearing something, or they have a Hindu name, and it's just the question's like, how did that happen? What is that supposed to mean? And there is some discomfort there too, right? So I've benefited from it, and I've also been uncomfortable by it. Yeah. And I think it'd be better if more of us were uncomfortable. Right?
Well, to prompt some exploration of what that's about.
Yes.
Because of that.
Yes.
There are many people that, I went through lay ordination in Buddhist traditions and have different names coming from that, but I don't use them. To me, that doesn't feel right. I'm Ted. I'm not, this other thing that's part of a rich experience. That's part of my life. And it's, for me, it was more true to who I am and respectful to not use that. And for others, it's, this is an aspect of my life that does have a light on it. And that's an important honoring of that. So yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't, yeah. And I try, and I don't want to be, out here judging and shaming people,
right.
But, I don't know. I don't know when I encounter that. I don't know, what that person's story is with their name, if their parents gave it to them and their parents have a whole history. Some Indian people look white too, you don't always know. And there have been times that I did find out the story and it was like, oh, really? And so there is that too. And, there's one of the, I don't remember if I wrote this in the article, but it's the distinction between self-expression and depth expression. Or am I taking on this name because I think it says something about me?
Right. You have it in there. It's a beautiful piece because that's come up in other interviews long past of some early days in some centers where a friend of mine who was there at the beginning of that place, and Western white folks would affect these strange ways of speaking and accents that were not a part of their background at all. And now you just sound like a bad movie. That's not honoring anything. It's really kind of just everything, including your own experience and engagement with the
and when you try on a culture like that, like it's a costume, like it's just self-expression, you make that culture two-dimensional. You flatten it, right? Yes. So I try to not jump to conclusions. So the next one is one of the other pitfalls. The third pitfall is, aren't there more important issues for us to be talking about?
A nice distraction. Look over there.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that the crux of my question about that is, why don't I ever hear people saying that about Kim Kardashian or
Right.
like people only seem to say things about things like cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
It comes up in that a lot. It's like, this is a conversation. Are we saying that there's just zero value to this conversation? Like, would you be bringing that up? It's like, what this is this is uncomfortable. This is a conversation. It's uncomfortable. What it really is, it's not, aren't there more important issues for us to be talking about? It's like, is there something we could talk about that takes less emotional energy for me?
Yeah.
Because I don't have it right now.
Right. Is there something that's not this?
Right. The fourth one is, so you think I'm being too sensitive. And this one I definitely got a lot of this from, when I posted the blog post on Medium. I'm also on Medium. I had a whole bunch of conservatives telling me I'm too sensitive, I'm a snowflake or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't write it for them. That's fine. But I did also hear this a couple times from liberals, and what the way it's framed is, I think we as liberals are too sensitive about things like this.
It seems to be very close to. It seems very close to the previous one. Is this is uncomfortable. Let's not be there. This seems to be related to that.
Yeah,
we're avoiding
it. It kind of gets couched in an analysis around why the left has trouble. Like the general, the left is too sensitive about something. And I think that's, we can have a whole conversation about that. But, my way of responding to this was, again, just, I don't think that that's the case. I think what's actually happening is that we all need to get better at just talking about this stuff without freaking out. And the last one, the fifth one, is we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So we can hold our value for individual freedom alongside our value for collective impact. We can do both of those things, but they don't have to come into conflict.
Yeah. So, and I like that, this concept that you brought up of it, these aren't mutually exclusive. And it's the, don't we have more important things to talk about? Well, yes, of course, we could be talking about a meteor crashing into the planet and we're all gone. Oh my goodness. But that doesn't make this not important. We can hold that too, and not use it as a way to avoid dealing with this discomfort, because it may very well be that way.
It reminds me a little bit of, so you are with a secular Buddhist who's been practicing mindfulness. I bet you saw that poem that was going around at the beginning of the year by Clarissa Pinkola Estes called "We Were Made for These Times," and I think that those of us who, like, so much of this is about mindfulness. When I wrote this, like I said, I wasn't writing it for conservatives. I was writing it for people who we share a lot of the same values. And for me, that includes the value of being able to observe and learn myself, and so this is a wonderful community of people who have a commitment to that. This is all about mindfulness. And if you've been meditating and practicing, if you've been in community with people who are interested in self-development, we've been training for these kind of conversations. We're not training for more sitting. We're training for this. So we are able to hold values that feel oppositional, but actually find the inquiry, find the place in ourselves that is big enough to hold them, to hold all of it. And hold the fact that what comes out of that for me might be different than what comes out of it for you.
So let's move. We've done the 5 now.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to the 7 questions. And this for me was just the gem of your article, was the way you handled this as an inquiry, as an exploration.
Yeah. And I want to, like, I have this little preface here that I want to touch on, which is the outcome of this inquiry. Maybe you adjust your behavior. Maybe you change something. Maybe you don't change anything, but you just have more mindfulness and humility about it. Or maybe that doesn't change, except you actually feel more grounded and less defended in whatever you are doing. So if somebody brings something up to you, you're able to hear them with more openness. Or are you just creating a teachable moment for somebody? You know, that's the way we hold this inquiry. Not that there's something that has to come, some particular thing that comes out of it, but just something will. And it'll be good because we, in this practice, we trust that the truth is good.
Not easy, not always nice or comfortable, but
yeah,
necessary for us to recognize.
And ultimately, it's freeing. So back to freedom. You know, the truth is actually freeing for us. You know, being able to stand it is freedom. So the 7+ questions for inquiry. So I mentioned this one before, which is, why do I believe my use of this cultural artifact, or what do I believe my use of this cultural artifact says about me? So an artifact could be, I gave myself a new name, or the style of clothes I wear, or just the words I use, or just a general cultural affinity that I have. What is it that this thing is that I'm using, and what is it that I believe that it says about me? And does that also say something about what I think about the people and culture this artifact came from? So for instance, am I using this as a way to seem more spiritual? And if I am using it to seem more spiritual, what does that say about how I see the people from that culture? Or how I see this geographic place, what I think when I see this place on the map? Do I have some cartoon version of it? And then it leads to the next one is, and am I perpetuating a stereotype? And this is a whole other blog post, but all stereotypes, even the ones that seem good, like those people are spiritual, that all of those are harmful, you know, because they turn us into cartoons. As soon as you say somebody, all people in a group are this, these people are all really good at math. It becomes easier to dismiss them because they're two-dimensional. They've become less complex. They've become less human and real.
I also wanted to say, as you were mentioning the first of them, is the examining, the introspection on, you know, what it says about me when I do something, whatever it may be. Is there the need for this externalization that perhaps is an inner thing? And is there a need to bolster that, or is there maybe the opportunity to deepen whatever that is, rather than creating an external anchor to hold on to, or matter? I think about the example that comes to mind just today, seeing a pickup truck with like 2 gigantic flags on it, and it was, to me, it brought up, maybe there's a great patriotism and there's a story there that I don't know.
Yeah.
And I have also seen where it's maybe less so. It's maybe a not so healthy nationalism, or a not so healthy externalization of what caring and loving your country should be.
Yeah.
That needed an external fist-waving banner behind it.
Yeah. We've got a lot of that going on here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I had an interesting conversation with somebody on Facebook who was telling us just a really so generous and lovely in sharing his story around this. And he was talking about how he went through a period of superficiality and how he used culture. And then as his practice deepened and his understanding of himself and the world and his understanding of truth, as all that deepened, the artifacts fell away. And so I don't have a lot of certainty about this, but I think there's a piece there about, there's a way that the question can be framed of, am I using this for self-expression or depth expression? Like, if I'm using this as self-expression, then it's a replacement. or because I can see, like, I've carried things in my pocket, carry a rock in my pocket to kind of remind me of something that I'm trying to develop in myself, and I can see, yeah, there, Ted just showed me a rock, everybody. And I can see someone wearing something around their neck that reminds them of something that's true inside of them, that they're trying to bring into the world more. And to me, that's depth expression, right. Or am I just wearing it because I think if people see me wear it, then they're going to associate me with a community that I want to be associated with, or practices, or they're going to know I do this, or because, I just think it's exotic. And this is why individual inquiry is so important, because I can't walk around looking at people knowing why they're wearing that necklace, but if people, I just have this is where I get a little Pollyanna, if we can all just get more compassionate and more honest and more real with each other and with ourselves, actually.
The tougher, maybe the tougher customer.
Yeah. If we can get more real with ourselves and more compassionate with ourselves, then we can trust ourselves, then we can trust ourselves to always be, looking for that North Star, of what's true about this. The fourth one is the way I use this as a function of my privilege. And I have an example there. And this is a interesting one. And there's an example that I linked to in the article, and I'm trying to decide right now if I want to try to explain it. Maybe I'll just let people click on it
themselves.
It's a real head spinner. And it's I think a really great example is last week I read in the news, it was in, I think, Alabama, a judge said that he ruled against a woman who was suing her company because they had fired her for having dreadlocks. She's Black. And the judge basically said, we are allowed to fire people for wearing dreadlocks. Because for some, and his, it was a terrible argument. And so that's what happens to Black women when they wear dreadlocks. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm blanking on her first name, but Whoopsie Whatsy Kardashian puts her hair in dreadlocks, and she's celebrated, and she's able to do that. She's able to wear dreadlocks and be celebrated for it, and turn dreadlocks into this really cool thing, new thing, mm-hmm. because she's white, because she's rich. I actually don't even know. Her skin is white. I don't know enough about the Kardashians. I think they're Greek. I don't know. But she's very wealthy. She's beautiful. She's a celebrity. Mm-hmm. And she has white skin privilege. And so her use of that is a function of her privilege. Her ability to use it and turn it and use it that way is a function of privilege. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of pop culture examples of that.
Yeah, we see there was a recent case. I don't recall which of my home states this was in, Minnesota or Massachusetts. I thought it was one of the two, where some couple of girls, I think they've been sisters, wore their hair a certain way, and the school said, "Oh, you can't do that." It made the news, and there was a big, happily, I'm glad to see, a big outcry saying, yeah, actually they can. This is just, mm-hmm. Are you kidding? And happily the school, the principal or the board or whatever, backtracked on it and said, yep, you're right. We changed our minds on this. But I'm continually surprised by the things that there's a decision made in a vacuum of awareness of potential consequences, or even the reasoning behind it. There just doesn't seem to be any. It's
because it's not white.
Because
it's not white.
Because it's not white. It's outside of the context of the paradigm.
Yeah, I kind of want to use this to just go back to that question of, are we being too sensitive? And I think that a lot of times, and that comes up, I wonder that sometimes too. And I think a lot of times when that question comes up, more often than not, there's some information that's missing.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to look at examples like that and just be like, oh, these people are just being too sensitive. About, the story you told about the hairstyle and the dreadlocks, and just that there's real life consequences for people because of attitudes about when it's white, it's good. When it's black, it's not.
Yeah, and it's wrong in so many ways for me to say what should be important to you.
Right.
It's not my call.
Right.
It's not anyone's call to say, well, you shouldn't care about this. And yet I do.
Right. So this next question, and actually that goes to this next. Yeah, the next one is, what is my relationship to the people of this culture? Do I know them? How well? Do I listen to them? Do I dismiss them? Do I believe that white Westerners do it better? That's a link. That was an aside, actually. Yep. Do I know how they would feel about what I'm doing? And if so, do I hold their objections with integrity? So, and that's that piece. Like, how dismissible is this group of people to me? And the more dismissible their concerns are, the more I know I'm missing information. Mm-hmm. I'm missing something. Yeah. And if it's hard for me to push aside their pain, then I know I have some relationship. If it's really easy, then
and I'm disconnected because it means nothing to me. Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, and number 7.
Number 7. So, where do I habitually place the burden of proof? I expect marginalized cultures to provide sufficient proof that what I'm doing is harmful. And I see this one too. There is an expectation of, I have a right to do this. And you're telling me I don't have a right to do this. This is the freedom trap again. Right. You're telling me I don't have a right to do this. I have a right to do this. And so for me to change my behavior when I have a right to do this, the burden of proof is on you. And that is a dominant culture way of thinking. That is the way that, this may be a generalization. It's just so different from the way I think. And I think that part of the reason I think the way I think is because I had that experience of being outside as well as inside the dominant culture. So that sense of entitlement, that sense of, I have a right to do what I want with this stuff. I don't have that. And I think the reframe is, you have a right to do whatever you want and a responsibility to listen to your own integrity, which I think for the people that I was writing this article for, progressives, our integrity is, there's that value that we share of listening and hearing out and listening across differences.
I think that might be a good segue to Dialogue Lab. I want you to just say a little bit more about that, if you would.
So Dialogue Lab is all about helping organizations and movements become stronger, become thriving, become more unstoppable. Really part of it is guided by just this thing that keeps grabbing my attention about how we get slowed down and how we get stopped in our tracks by bad conversations, just badly constructed conversations, and just wanting better conversations, right? Yeah. And the stand that I'm taking is that building a culture of dialogue is a way to transform. So some of this is a response to the election that we just had. This is an interest of mine and a passion of mine for a long time. And then we had this election, and everything just got, higher brighter and more distinct, more clear about what's needed. And that clarity took time. But this stand that I'm taking with Dialogue Lab is that a culture of dialogue is a way to undo the culture of burnout and disengagement and stuckness and conflict that we often experience in progressive spaces. So it's partly has to do with the political climate we're in, and part of it is just stuff we've been dealing with for a long time. The political climate we're in, I think, makes it more important that we are strong, that we're thriving. And, what I've been looking at is not so much how do we build bridges with Trump voters and how do we build bridges with conservatives, but how do we build bridges to each other? How do we find our alignment? How do we transcend the things that keep us apart and keep us from being able to move together where there is possibility for moving together? Yeah. It's not about smoothing over differences. Like the thing I want to be clear about, it's not about smoothing over differences. It's not about or smoothing over differences just for the sake of maintaining a status quo. It's about using conflict, using our differences as a means to transcend where we've been so we can get to where we need to be. And, engaging our strengths, using our creativity together, finding our resilience through conflict, through setbacks, finding our flow and finding our momentum. I think dialogue has the capacity to help us do a lot of that.
Thank you so much for being here, for sharing and talking about these, because it's there's an added richness just to hearing your voice on this, and all the voices of the guests here who talk about these things that are more and more critical, I think, as time goes on in the time we're in right now. So our guest today, Reva Patwardhan. Reva, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate speaking with you about all of this.
Oh, thanks, Ted. This was really fun.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.